Howdy. All right, here we go. Flea Factory's first live stream. Let's just put it out there. We don't know what we're doing, but it's fun. And so if it's fun, we're going to go with it. So welcome. If you don't know me, I'm Richard Sharp. I run Flea Factory. I work with people in all sorts of different sectors and different organisations and at different stages of their life. And I'm passionate about helping people work out how to put their lives together and how to run healthy organisations and groups as well. So today I wanted to go live and basically invite you into a conversation. Now, I have these kinds of conversations with people all the time, and especially with the guest I have on today. But we thought, why don't we just have one of these conversations live online and see if anybody might be interested in joining us? And I guess if you're a fly on the wall, you can chuck a question if you feel like it. So if something we're talking about means you want to ask a question or you want to lean into the conversation, hit a comment and we'll be able to see that. Hello, Zach. I can see this is cool. We're going to work this already. So my mate Zach in Hong Kong. How are you, Zach? It's good to have you, mate. So I want to introduce to you a really good mate of mine. His name is Travis Johnson. He is the director of an organisation called Access the Story. But we have these kinds of conversations all the time about leadership. And we thought today we jump into a convo that we've started to have over the last sort of week and a half around the idea of post-heroic leadership. So we're going to unpack what that might mean. We're not experts on this, but we are people who've been in leadership for a long time. And I guess we're just trying to rumble with the ideas of what it means, what it looks like. And we just want to develop the conversation. We're just trying to hone our own leadership skills as well as encourage others as they develop theirs. So how about I say hello to Trav? How are you, Trav? Look at that.
I'm very well, Richard.
The
Thank you very much.
technology works in everything, Trav. It's cool, isn't it? Fun and games. Now, we've done podcasts together before and all sorts of that kind of stuff. And as I said, we constantly have these discussions. But this is the first time we've kind of been live in this space having this chat. So we've had a bit of an idea of what we might chat about, but we don't really know where this is going to go today. But if I was to kind of set up our convo for today, I thought I might show a quote that we discovered together the other week. We were talking about a Zoom call that I'd been on with some international leaders, and you were going to be on that call, but you just couldn't make it that morning. And we ended up having a bit of a debrief. And as we were kind of talking around that stuff, this quote sort of popped up. And so let me stick this up here. So this was the quote. Whereas the heroic manager of the past knew all, could do all, and could solve every problem, the post-heroic manager asks how every problem can be solved in a way that develops other people's capacity to handle it. Now, the quote alone was good, but it was made by one of my favourite people of all time, Charles Handy, who we won't get into today. Maybe this is a topic of another live stream, but Charles wrote a book called Elephant and the Flea, and it's one of the reasons, the reason why this is called Flea Factory. So can I ask you, Trav, you immediately, as soon as we read that out, went, oh, that's amazing. What were your first thoughts when you read that quote, and what comes to mind in your own leadership? And maybe there's some of the leadership you see around you at the moment, and we think we'd like to see around us moving into this kind of new normal of the world that we're living in at the moment.
Yeah, I think it hit a particular context for me. So in recent weeks, I've managed to take the opportunity to step into a transitional space with our local churches. Program amongst young people, and one of the things that I stepped into was leadership transition. I also stepped into a COVID-19 restriction environment pretty quickly, and having some online kind of engagement in the past, I felt like I had something to bring. As I look back, there was a sense of there's some expertise I've brought in to be able to transition from nothing's online and we're all doing things together to we can't do that anymore. So how do we do a program and basically a service program for young people online? And so we're able to in an agile manner be able to flip into that pretty quickly. But of course, here in Australia, we're now I guess we're staring into the abyss of what post restrictions look like. You know,
Sure.
and how do we move forward from here? And I had this moment where I quickly realised I just don't have any expertise at all. I felt like I have no expertise at all to offer the situation as far as leadership goes. And so this quote helped me realize that there's a sense where I've stepped into, you know, and we do this often as, you know, in leadership roles, we step into a heroic moment. But what's it look like now that my heroism has lapsed? I've got nothing to offer on the table. You know, how do we move forward here? And so this idea of the post-heroic manager asking how every problem can be solved in a way that develops other people's capacity to handle it really intrigued me, because I'm surrounded by a bunch of young leaders who probably have more potential and capacity what they realise. Right. And so if there's a way for me to be able to facilitate an environment where they step into that and not only surprise themselves but others around them as to how we can traverse the landscape that's in front of us. So yeah, so it was a particular context that I was thinking of, I suppose, and sure. Of course it has broader implications.
It's funny, isn't it? And we've done a little bit of reading. We've flicked each other back and forth a few articles and a few web pages, and I said to you just before we started, I feel like we may have just taken the lid off something that's a little bit bigger than we thought we had. And I'm not sure we know where the edges are. And I guess I think that the reality is many people are still looking for heroic leaders. What I want to say as a bit of a catch is, I don't think there's anything wrong with this kind of strong, heroic kind of leadership at times, in the same way as there's nothing wrong with the idea of post-heroic leadership. That I think there's something we can learn from both of these. What I find often, I know you've experienced this, but often when we look at leaders, say we have a leader in an organization and they have a certain style, they have a certain way of leading, and then they leave, we tend to swing the pendulum really hard, and the next person we hire is almost the polar opposite of the last person. It's like this reaction that we and it's about style ultimately more than substance usually. It's usually about just the way they kind of portray themselves. And I think my experience has been that swinging the pendulum hard to both extremes is not necessarily all that helpful, that actually somewhere in the middle, somebody who can access all sorts of different kind of leadership styles and qualities is actually what we're after. Now, whether that person fully exists, whether that's a concept rather than a reality, I don't know. But I think it is valid in a time like this for us to realize that all of those skill sets are important. Now, I know recently you have been doing some online chatting in the mornings. You've just kind of been processing some thoughts as things go on. I know you've recently talked about some of the leaders we're seeing around us in different states and in sport as well, and in state governments and all those kinds of things. What are you seeing in some of those in those people in leadership roles? What kinds of leadership elements are you seeing that are making you interested, or making you go, that's really effective? Is there something you're seeing at the moment in this current situation?
So a simple example that I can think of it was actually a comment on a couple of comedians,
yep.
and that was, there was around the same time. Well, it was when. There was a little bit of a furor that went up around Ellen DeGeneres, where she was talking in terms of how bad it was for her being in lockdown.
Yes.
And of course, her context for being in lockdown and somebody in a developing world country is completely different, or even a working class situation, and so it wasn't. It wasn't received well by the public, and what I thought of at that moment was, then there's another comedian. So comedians are used to having like an audience. They're used to leading a group of people through a a comedic experience where people, when they get an easy response, and to the sense where they're leading those their fans, and all of a sudden that environment it's gone, and so she now has no live audience. So what does she do as a comedian? She attempts to bring humor into a situation, and the way that she did that was she put a mirror up to say how bad it was for her, hoping that others would relate to her, where in fact they didn't.
Which is kind of the key to comedy, right? Is you hold something up, you kind of laugh at it and hope that people join you in that observation.
Yeah, and so most times comedians are able to read the room, but if there's no one in the room, how do you read it?
Yeah, right.
Whereas I immediately contrasted that with Pete Hellier on the project, who has been running a little segment called Life in Lockdown, and what he's doing is he's heroing the experience of other people, and so my observation was, here's someone who's heroing their own experience and trying to elevate that and hopefully get a laugh out of that, whereas Pete Hellier was giving a platform for others. And of course, what's interesting since then is that that segment has now been that segment's on every night. It's not just a weekly segment; it's every night on their show, and they have sponsorship for it from Menulog, and so it's become this, which is ironic, but it's become this thing. And I guess my observation is he's providing a platform for others to tell their story of their experience in the situation they're facing right now, and I guess for me that is in some ways an analogy of what we're talking about, where the heroic leader takes on the responsibility for themselves. They have the platform, so they feel like they have the responsibility to make decisions, to push forward, whereas perhaps a post-heroic leader recognizes the value of the stories of others and provides a platform for them to be able to tell that, knowing that perhaps the way that we need to go is going to be told through their capacity, through their stories, through their experience. And so I guess that's one example. I kind of think it's just interesting under pressure what we see in one another as human beings for the benefit of society, but also sometimes perhaps for the ill. And it's just and no one would seek a pandemic, but I've found it really intriguing to discover I guess more about human behavior in the times that we live.
Especially as we enter a time where I think we're leaning on each other more and more and realizing the value of community and connection. That that statement of we're in this together, we will get through this together. What people are not necessarily looking for is the hero or the savior of this moment as an individual. They're looking for this kind of idea that together we may come up with the ideas that are necessary. Now, what's interesting to me though is there is still need for leadership while that is happening, right? Because, the idea of post-heroic leadership being that we are postured towards collaboration and lots of people have different ideas, and it's not just about what I want and you coming in line with me, but it's actually us together. There is still a need for clear, decisive leadership, but having taken into account the collaboration, the ideas, the creativity, the innovation, and the individual gifting and skills of the people at your disposal. So what I want to say about this kind of idea to post-heroic leadership doesn't mean that decisive, clear leadership from people in positions where they need to lead, that doesn't null and void the need for that kind of leadership, but it means it's not out on its own.
Like an example of the pendulum swing of a shared leadership model is the idea that we need to gain consensus on everything before we're able to move forward. And of course, what that does is it provides a bottleneck for decision making.
Yeah.
And there is no way in the context of a crisis where we can afford to have that kind of consensus bottleneck, like flat out, no way.
No.
And so there is still that need, both from the point of view of being able to get things done, but also people's expectations are that someone needs to be able to make a call on certain things. And so once they do that, if they're the right person to do that, then we'll follow them if they've been given the authority, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
So I think a classic example is what we wouldn't have seen 3 or 6 months ago is Gillan McLaughlin needing to listen to Nicola Spurrier. So Gillan McLaughlin is the head of AFL, has a huge responsibility for the culture of Australia to be able to get sport back onto the map, get the fixtures happening, fulfill all the requirements as far as restrictions go. He's got a huge responsibility, and so and I would say in the past he's one figurehead in our culture who's once he says something, it happens. That's it. Whether you like it or not, he's the head of AFL, so he's made a decision as far as football goes. So he was stopped dead in his tracks a couple of weeks ago when Nicola Spurrier said to him, no, that's not going to happen.
Yes.
We will not give an exemption for Port Adelaide and Adelaide Crows players to be able to re-enter our state after they've played interstate. They need to have the 14, so they need to have the 14 days isolation. And so here is a medical expert dictating terms to the head of AFL, something you wouldn't have seen 3 to 6 months ago. But now that just makes sense because we all know and love Nicola Spurrier. We've gotten to trust her every evening when she delivers the results of the COVID-19 statistics each day. We hang on her every word, and sometimes she'll tell us things that we don't like to hear, but because of the expertise that she brings and the capacity she has in this particular moment, we will follow her every word. We will be more than happy to submit to her leadership, and so is that a shared leadership model still? Yeah, I think it is, because it's the likes of a premier and other officials who have given her the platform because she's the one who's able to tell the story that we need to hear right now. So I find that one again a really interesting example of how there's been a shift, but also you're right, it's an example of what you're saying. Here's someone who needs to make a call, and we need to hear that call and follow after that. But that's not to say that she doesn't necessarily fit the mold of the big alpha dog leader. She's everyone's mum who's just quietly spoken, and but everyone's really keen to hear what she has to say. So that's an interesting observation.
That is that blend, right? It's the blend of collaboration and listening, championing others, listening to innovation, listening to all of the things. I'm sure there are people in who she leads in her direct department, in her positional leadership role, who maybe don't fully agree with everything she's decided to do. Now, that doesn't mean that she's not being collaborative, and it doesn't mean she's not being post-heroic, but it means that at some point, there's a point where we need to bring that together and say, okay, well, then we're going to move forward. Patrick Lencioni, the great kind of leadership consultant and writer, talks about that. He says about being in the room, he says you should do a few things. You should, as a leader, you should mine for conflict. It's one of the things you should do. You should be aware enough and secure enough in your role and your leadership and who you are, that what a good leader does is they mine for conflict. So they say, what do you think about this decision? Let's go. Say it. Let's have it here in the room. Let's do it. And a good self-aware leader will allow that to happen, will listen to all of those things. But there comes a time where in that room, before you leave that room, as a leadership team, you make a decision. And whatever has happened in that room around discussion, you will now walk out of that room together with one voice. And you will not undermine it, and you will not talk about it, and you will not say, we're not going to do it even though I promised I would. We're going to do this together, and we've made a decision. Now, the only way that happens is if that leader has genuinely heard the people in the room. That only happens. If you think you've let them talk and they haven't, and they haven't had the ability to have a dissenting opinion, there is no way that people will follow that leadership. But actually people, if they have an opportunity to be heard, have an opportunity to bring their skill sets and their thoughts and their backgrounds to a decision, more often than not, given that kind of a leadership space and a security in leadership from their leader, direct leader, will get on board things that maybe they do not fully understand in the moment, but they see that there's bigger things at play. And I think that's the kind of leadership we're after. And I think it is post-heroic, because ultimately it's not about the leader. It's not about using the people in the room to achieve my agenda. It's about us bringing a direction together, but then I still take the responsibility of moving forward, of moving this group forward. And I think that's it's interesting, as I prepared and started to read a few things, there's lots of people who are really pro-heroic leadership. Like it's not like, this isn't everybody's on board with the post-heroic and no one likes but the thing is, they understand the value of when more strong, passionate leadership is necessary. And what they're trying to, I think, say with the pendulum, what they're trying to say is, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like, don't let go of the good qualities of a strong, charismatic, clear, articulate leader who can make choices and make decisions and stand up to the AFL. Don't send that away. There's elements of that that are still valuable.
Yeah. One of the things that comes to mind when you say that is the idea. So that one of the articles that we read together was around the post-heroic perspective on leadership as a collective construction. So this idea that leadership is a collective construction process. And so one of the things that I found helpful to give that a picture is leadership is not in the chair, it's on the table. And we get to sit around the table together and discern how leadership can happen, unpack the gift of leadership that's on the table. And sometimes somebody's going to speak more loudly from one of the chairs, and other people will need to sit quietly because they don't have the expertise around that conversation. But at the end of the day, leadership is on the table. Now, one of the values that is found in the heroic model is the fact that somebody at the end of the day, from a public perspective, whether it's a company or some organization or a team, somebody represents the DNA of the team.
Yeah.
Somebody is going to be a focal point that kind of draws people to this symbol or this representation of, this is what this organization is about. This person, lives and breathes this our football club, or this person is able to articulate really clearly the vision of our organization. And so even in the midst of a post-heroic model, there's still needs to be this allowance for a figurehead, for someone who is kind of named as a leader, both from a community expectation, but also it's probably a healthy thing to have someone who is able to represent that well. That doesn't mean the person who's not as vocal or doesn't have the capacity to be able to articulate clear vision isn't as influential in the team. It just means that the role is different. And the case studies that are mentioned in that article really give some really good examples of being able to identify that and recognize and respect the different roles that are a part of a team, as leadership is a collective construction rather than just someone sitting in a chair and saying, I'm the leader.
Absolutely. I think one of the things we need to recapture is the understanding that leadership is a privilege. Like, it's a real privilege to have the opportunity to lead people. Like, that's not a small thing. And I think if I was to categorize the heroic leadership, it's a constant striving. Like, the negative part of heroic leadership is the constant striving to get to the position of leadership, because becoming a leader is the end goal, because then I can mold things into the way that I like them. Here's my experience of leadership. As you become further and further up those kind of opportunities to lead, I just become more acutely aware of the responsibility and the privilege and the weight that holding that leadership role has. That actually, in my experience, I didn't get freer and more able to kind of just impose my will on things, but actually the role became far more about the people I led than what I wanted to achieve. And I remember, I think it's Patrick Lencioni again says, he talks to lots of CEOs and he says, who's the most important person in your company? And he said, and you know what? He said, I have a bunch of CEOs who say to me, our customers. And he says, that's the wrong answer. As a CEO, that's the wrong answer. He says, the answer for a CEO is my people. That's the most important. The people who work in this organization. Because you know what? Those people in your organization, their most important person is your customer. And if you're not looking after the people that you're entrusted to lead, they are the ones that need caring for, they need bringing along a journey, they need visioning with purpose and value, and Simon Sinek would say a strong why, a big noble cause by which to kind of attach themselves to. If they are not led in a way where they have a noble cause to attach themselves to, and then they are not brought in collaboratively into that process, then literally they're just hired hands. And I guess, a bit like Amazon, you can just replace them with robots to achieve the end. But if you actually care about the process of the people you lead and the actual people you lead, that's where the power happens. That's where something truly different happens. But I think the noble cause is important, and I think we need people with a bit of a heroic, innovative mindset to pioneer and, as you said, hold that. Someone who kind of holds the DNA of the organization or the business or the whatever it is we're a part of. They're the people who wake up in the morning holding that and firing that up. And I think there's heroic elements in that. But you've got to take people on the journey with you. And I think that's the responsibility and the honor that it is to lead a group of people. You know.
One of the things that that I think is, so there's a mindset shift, I think. So someone who has the makeup of an heroic leader, the paradigm shift really is in that space of being able to make the decision as to what I do with the power that has been that I've been entrusted with. Right. If I take personal responsibility for the protection of that power, then I'm going to come unstuck. Yeah. But if I take personal responsibility for the stewardship and distribution of that power, then that becomes a different environment. So one of the things I loved in the article that we've been referring to is that I really saw that sense of that power being distributed through management activity. And so again, around the table, recognizing the strengths and capacities and where one another's roles crossed over, how people work together and how they were empowered to go and do the thing that they're supposed to do as part of the team, knowing that they are stewards of the leadership that has been entrusted to them as a team. And so, I think so it's that mindset shift of moving from being the owner and protector of the leadership gift that has been bestowed upon a leader, and yes. And them being able to go, actually this is something to share. And what happens ironically is you end up raising up other leaders around you simply by distributing that power environment into the conversation and the process of constructing something together.
Strikes. So I've just had so I thought, so I've been watching. I don't know if have you been watching the Michael Jordan Netflix series?
Oh, yes.
That thing's fascinating. Number one. But I'm just thinking about. I heard once. I heard a rugby union player from Wales talk about the honour it was to represent his country, and he said something really fascinating. He said, when you put on the Welsh rugby shirt, what you realise is this is not your shirt. He said, you're just borrowing it for a while. He said, and you have the privilege and the honor to wear it for a short season. And so you realize the weight and the responsibility and the privilege that is. And then I flick that across to the idea, say in the NBA, where we retire people's jerseys. Like, not only, so no one can have your number and that is your jersey forever. Like, you have heroically earned the right that thing hangs from the rafters till the end of time. No one will ever kind of, and they're at odds, right? That's a bit of that shift you're talking about, right? It's little, but it's everything.
Yeah.
Have you been watching that Netflix show? Has that been?
Yes, I have.
Yes. What have you learned about leadership from that, Travis?
Well, it resonates with me. So, I don't know a lot about rugby. From my understanding of rugby, you wear a jersey, you wear a jumper with a specific number on it that gives you a role to do,
a position
on. Yep. So, right. Well, it's a function. It's actually you have a job to do as part of this team, and the number on your back actually tells everybody that's the function that you.
That's exactly true. Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas the number 23 on a red or white or black tank top, with a particular insignia on it, tells us about the story of one person.
Yeah. And what that one person achieved.
Yeah, what that person achieved, and that person's highs and lows and everything. But you're right. It's it hangs up in the club room forever and a day. Yeah. As a retired number. It makes me wonder what's going to happen in 400 years with basketball. Will there be any numbers left? Like, will the jerseys be big enough to
retire that many numbers?
But that's true.
But they do. The one thing I give, that's not given away loosely or lightly, right? That is a big deal. But
yeah.
But yeah, for me, that's a fascinating. There's a multitude of areas that documentary is fascinating on, but definitely more of what I would imagine a heroic model of leadership.
And there's a tension in it because you give the ball to Jordan because he's going to deliver. That's his role in the team.
Right.
And so who do you pass it to in the last 1.2 seconds? You pass it to Mike.
Yep.
There's no question.
Yep.
And if you asked him the same question, he said.
And he was in that documentary. He was asked. He said, 3 seconds left. Who takes a shot? And he goes, me. Like what? Like
me.
Like that's such a dumb question.
And it's like, for anyone else, it's complete arrogance and hubris. Like and that's there's another part to this that I'd love to unpack. But when you look at history, the reality was he was actually the best. Like certainly the documentary portrayed it that way. There's just no question. And so while you for me, sometimes it made my skin crawl from the point of view of the arrogance that seems to be not only his, but it's just such a part of the culture of certain sports, which I found really hard to deal with in regards to sportsmanship and all that sort of thing, and teamsmanship. But when you look at history again, he was out of the box. Like, he was incredible.
Yeah.
And so it's like, there's a real tension there between the stepping into the heroic and being okay with that, but also, if you really pull back the layers and you talk to some of the mates, they would definitely say nothing could have been achieved the way it was achieved without good people around him as well. So
and that's fascinating.
So it's an interesting one.
Go. Sorry, finish.
No, I'm just saying it was an interesting.
Yeah.
Just to experience that tension.
And it is fascinating because I think you start hearing everyone on the team say, like, we won because of that attitude and that leadership. That didn't mean they liked it all the time. And it wasn't necessarily enjoyable. And there's a couple of moments I like. There seems to be this turning point at times where he starts to realize he can rely on other people as well, and that seems to be a bit of a turning point. Well, one of my favorite bits is when they win I think it's the last championship. Steve Kerr stands up at the big celebration and he says, he took the winning shot, and he said, we turned to Mike and we said, Mike, we want you to take the shot. And he said, and Mike looked at me and said, I don't feel real comfortable with that. I think we should give it to Steve. And everyone laughed because they realized how ridiculous that statement was. Yes. There's just no way he would ever say that. The other character in that documentary that's fascinating to me, and I think this is exactly the balance we're talking about. Phil Jackson is the post-heroic leader, I think.
Yes.
For me, is the embodiment of, as a coach, which is this is our segue, I guess, that role of coach where you bring out the best in the people you have. You enable certain people to be who they are. You let Mike be himself. You let Dennis Rodman be himself, even in ways that may not be typical or many people would say helpful to the team. But he understood the bigger picture, and he led a group of people of collaboration and innovation and success. But I found that contrast between Phil Jackson and Michael Jordan to be a fascinating dichotomy of leadership styles. And I think it proves, though, you need both. Because could you imagine having Michael Jordan there without Phil Jackson, or vice versa? You'd have a problem. You would be probably very heavy on one style of leadership, and you may not have got the results. So I found that very interesting. Phil Jackson is not the person I thought he was. I learned a lot more about him through that documentary than I thought I would. It's just I just enjoy watching Phil Jackson make Michael Jordan do yoga.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah. And I mean, without giving too much away, if someone hasn't watched the series,
they won. I don't know what do you like? They won like
the
lots.
Titanic,
so.
Yeah, the Titanic sunk, everybody.
Yeah.
So the retelling of that moment where the team was being dispersed and Phil Jackson had that ceremony. That was really powerful, and insight into a leader like Phil Jackson, the post-heroic, even being able to, because he was the one who had all the pressure on him from the point of view of he was told, and everyone knew that this was his last season. He's done. For him to step into a space of grief and closing, and facilitate that process well, where the team was able to finish well, mark the end of the season, not just the basketball season, but the season for the dynasty. It's a really good insight into, so there's lessons in that of even in the midst of tragedy and being pulled apart. A post-heroic leader is able to care for the needs of the team around them, even in the closure of it. That was really powerful.
Yeah, it was. Well, it's a good segue in a way. Let me change gears a bit, because as I started to think about the importance in a way of both types of leadership, and that there are elements of them. I think what you're noticing with the Bulls is, and what would be alive totally every day with them, is something called the small group process. So the development of a group over time. Okay, so you talked about that kind of morning experience at the end of their time, but the small group process talks about forming, storming, norming, performing, and mourning. They're the stages of development of a small group, and many people may be aware of it or not. But the reality is that groups, whether it's an organization or a team or whatever group of people, they go through this small group process all the time. Like if you've taken a bunch of kids away on a school camp, you've witnessed it happen. If you've been in a sporting team, you witness it happen all the time. And so this idea that these things are inevitable, and they're not linear. So you don't just go this step, this step, this step. You're always ebbing and flowing, back and forth. And every time you add a new member to the group, you're going to go back into a forming, storming stage where people work out who's who in the zoo, for want of a better term, you know. And it's only when you get to people to a point, a group to a point where you get them through this norming stage where they're happy to just be doing life together. They can have fun at training, say, they just enjoy each other's company. That when you flick the switch and say it's time to perform, they go and do a job that we're on. But if you try and get people to perform when they're in a different stage, it's just not possible. Okay, we see it most in sporting teams. It's very easy to identify. You can actually, because it's quite easy to rate their success at performance. That's why it's useful there. But the tool for a leader. So the tool for a leader in this is the idea that you are aware of situational leadership. So you are aware that at times, depending on where your group is in this process, you are going to need to lead in a different way to achieve a different outcome, to move your group along this process. So there will be times where a heavier hand is helpful and a big goal and a task and a big why for people to achieve will be really needed, maybe a little bit more heroic in posture. And there will be other times where mourning the loss, taking things slowly, bringing things down, collaborative, hearing everybody's voice is going to be really important. If you try to heroically lead at that point, you're going to have problems. So this idea of situational leadership, I think, is actually key in understanding how elements of both heroic and post-heroic leadership, why they're important, I think. So I've just had let me put this up right here. Zach just, this is a good point, really similar to the relationship between Steve Jobs, Tim Cook, and Steve Wozniak, I would imagine as well, right? So you've got Steve Jobs and Tim Cook is probably that pendulum swing. They're pretty different.
Yeah.
But also I think you've probably got that Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak thing. Very different kind of. Steve Wozniak wanted to give everything away. He didn't want to earn $1 from it. But it's that blend of those two things. So back to how do we contain that? I guess what thoughts do you have around that situational leadership stuff, and where do you see people doing that well, and do you see people being equipped in it or encouraged to do it? I've thrown that question at you out of nowhere. I know.
Yeah. So just an anecdote that we did a funny after different events that we've run in our teams, we just do a bit of a debrief and comment on what did you see in one another, what did you see in your team members. Yep. And my wife commented once how she saw my leadership like Jake from Adventure Time. I'm not sure if you've seen much of Adventure Time,
but keep going.
But the yellow dog Jake is just able to change his shape according to whatever situation is required. Right. So I kind of took that as a compliment. I'm the yellow dog off of Adventure Time.
Yeah.
But there is that idea of knowing how to adapt to the environment that you find yourself in. Of course, the risk in that is, the subtext to it, I suppose, is, we're taught to lead out of conviction. So I certainly was to lead out of what is for me, it was God honoring, to lead out of a sense of care for others, to lead out of integrity. And so that means there's going to be times where there's no compromise and things like that. Yeah. And so recognizing some of the value of that, but also recognizing, again, we talked before about reading the room, recognizing there's some factors at play here that, to use the word that we've heard a lot recently, that are unprecedented. Yeah. So what do we need to listen for, and how can we respond as a team to the circumstances that we find ourselves in? So Yeah, so I think there is a tension there. It's learning how not to compromise who we are, and
Sure.
not to compromise, the values and principles we live by, but also, being Jake from Adventure Time, and
Right.
being able to
Yeah, and I think that's
being
interesting,
able
isn't
to
it? Because I think
morph.
people judge that it's like I talked to I had a coaching relationship with a leader, and leader said to me when I said, you can lead and communicate in different ways with different staff because they need it. They need to be communicated to differently. And the leader said to me, "No, I have to say the same thing, so they all get the same thing." I said, "No, you have to say the same thing, but you can say it in a different way." And so I think there's this idea sometimes that I have to just lead, and if some people get how I lead, great, and if other people don't, well, that's their problem. And I've always said, it's on you. Like, I think as a leader, it's on me to adapt the way that I lead my people. That's on me. That's not on the people who are part of the thing I lead to kind of decode me and work me out and constantly be trying to figure out how to get along with me. That's on me. That's my responsibility to shape my leadership around a way where when I communicate, the people I communicate to understand what I mean, that they understand why I mean what I mean, and they understand that I'm ready to listen to them. That's on me. So for me, situational leadership is about changing style, not substance, right? And so I encouraged this leader. I said, no, try this week. What would it look like for you this week to communicate this one thing which you've told me you need to get across to your whole staff? What would it look like for you to communicate this same thing with the same details, but communicate in different ways to each different staff, if they all need a different model? And they took that on as a challenge. A week later, what do you know? The buy-in from the staff was incredible. And I said, did it take more energy? They said, yeah, it did. I said, short term, but did it take more energy long term? And they said, no, I don't think it will, because they all understand and they're all on board. I said, so you've actually just limited the conflict you're about to have for the next month by adapting and changing the way you've led and the way you've communicated. So I think this situational leadership is super important, and it's not a compromise. Is what I'm trying to communicate. It's okay, and there will be moments. So can I throw this up? Is this something? Let me see if this will work.
Sure.
Let me throw this up. This might be helpful as we kind of ponder through it. But so let's have a look. Some of these might be a bit more post-heroic and some might be more heroic, is my instinct, right? So situational leadership. So coaching leaders who work on individuals' personal development as well as job-related skills. This style works best with people who know their limitations and who are open to change, okay? So there may be a time where, as a leader, I coach the people around me. Now, that's very post-heroic, I would imagine. It's a very others-centered, together. If I get the most out of my people, we all win. That's a win for all of us. But the next one sounds a little bit heroic to me, right? This kind of idea of pace-setting leaders. Set very high expectations for the people they lead. This style works best, with self-starters who are highly motivated. The leader leads by example. This style is used sparingly since it can lead to follower burnout. Now, here's the thing. I think people think you can either be a coaching leader or a pace-setting leader. My statement is, I think at times, as a leader, you should be able to lead your people in both of those ways. Does that kind of make sense? Do you think that's a valid statement?
Yeah, I think so. What interests me, and I'll pose this question to you, is in managing the expectations of those who are in the team. Yep. And so, are there expectations going to be that you're a pace-setting leader, and that's how you operate, and so I'm going to follow in that and lead in that same way, or are you know what I mean? Like, what are the tells? What are the ways to communicate the expectations? Yeah.
Well, I think what's really important. I think if you come into a new leadership position, one of the early things you want to be doing is really showing people this kind of stuff and actually saying, look, this is what I believe about leadership. I think helping set expectations from the beginning would be really helpful. So sitting the people down that you're being entrusted to lead and say, you know what, let me give you an insight into my leadership style and what I believe about leadership. And I guess outlining that there are times when these are potentially going to be the way and what we're going to need as this team moves through its stages. And I guess then having some kind of mutually agreed upon way of knowing when we're maybe changing gears. And for me, I think that again is quite post-heroic, to actually equip and give the skills to your team for them to start to read their own culture in their group, that they're part of it. It's not just about you. And sometimes you may have to go there first, because that's also part of leadership. Because if everybody saw what you saw as a leader, everyone would do it instinctively. There may be times you go there first, but if you've set a groundwork of what leadership is, because I think it's another one of these words we think we all agree on, but I'm not sure we all are talking about the same thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yep. So one of the things you've got there, the Goldman theory has, is the democratic leaders. Can you think of an example of when? What's an example of when that's super appropriate in a team situation? Like, when is it?
Sure.
When used in optimal conditions. What are the optimal conditions for a democratic approach?
I think optimal conditions for a democratic leadership is when something you're discussing is A, not time sensitive, and 2, maybe not completely critical to. There genuinely is more than one way you could go. So like it really is genuinely that kind of input is needed. Like, when some leaders, there's really only one choice or two choices, and instead you've seen a leader say, so what does everybody think?
Yeah.
And that is, if there's literally only one or two options, asking what everybody thinks is really unhelpful. And so, but there are times where there are multiple directions we could go as a business or as an organization, and none of them really seem right or wrong. They don't. So we're going to mine for creativity and innovation and opinions and learning. And as a leader, I don't have a vested interest in the one outcome. I'm actually okay in the field we play. There's a field in which I've defined the boundaries. This is the organization. We've defined the boundaries. Now go and play. Let's go run around in that field. I think there's a real value to that kind of democratic leadership, where you trust it to the group and say, we're all in this together. Let's try and find an answer together. But there will come a point where a decision will need to be made. And if we now have 100 ideas, I think then it comes down to a leader that can facilitate the refining of those ideas. And we see that right in, let's not get into politics today, but like fully, but yes, we have democratically elected leaders, and they are to represent the people. And they should take the ideas of the electorate, of the people. They should take that in. But there does come a point where that leader is going to need to make a decision and vote on something in Parliament. And I can guarantee you, not everybody in their electorate is going to have agreed with the way that they vote in Parliament. So I think there's still a point, if there's a decision to be made where a leadership needs to maybe switch, and with all of that taken into consideration. But I think there are places in our organisations and our businesses where really any of the outcomes are quite okay. So let's explore it together. I guess they're my thoughts. There are 3 more of these. Let me flick over.
Yeah,
here's 3 more. So we can see how some of these, if it's the only thing you did, you may actually be an ineffective leader, like long term. So this kind of affiliate leader who puts employees first. This style is used when morale is very low. The leader uses praise and helpfulness to build up team's confidence. This style may risk poor performance when team building is happening. So again, if your team's not in that place where that's what they need, if that's the only style of leadership you access, your long-term ability to lead that group is going to be diminished. But it would certainly help if you had the capacity to lead in that way given certain moments. I think that's the key. And for me, it's like this out of one-dimensional leadership, which I see a lot of people lead. They just, this is how I lead, and I'll always lead like this. Whether it works or not, this is just who I am. And I'm trying to say, well, maybe there's multiple things you could access as a leader. That's my... So again,
what do you think?
You go.
Sorry, go.
No, go.
What do you think in regards to? So I talked earlier regarding moving from no restrictions in a leadership capacity, like no with COVID-19, into heightened restrictions.
Yep.
There's a sense where that put a lot of pressure. We needed to be agile. We needed to change things pretty quickly, but we're able to do it, and partly because there's a sense of moving things online was not unfamiliar. Certainly, to a certain degree, not for me. Certainly not for the young adult leaders that I've been kind of working with recently. Though it was really quick, no problem. But now we go from tight restrictions to those being eased, and wanting to be able to execute those stages well. Of these, different, as far as situational leadership goes, of these 6 different types of leadership or approaches, what do you think are 1 or 2 that are just really important right now in stepping into this phase of coming out of restrictions?
Look,
sorry about that.
No,
That's
so I'll give you a couple, but again, it's going to super depend on each specific thing you're leading. Like, I don't actually know if there is a generic out of this situation. What is the kind of leadership we need? Because I just think it depends also what the groups have experienced. So if COVID has caused a real deep sort of anxiety and a loss and a real sense of like disruption, not in a kind of creative, innovative way, but a real kind of it's been, people have had hours cut back, things have been hard, and now we don't know where to go next. Look, an affiliate leader is absolutely one of the styles that you're going to want. You're going to want people, if their morale is low, to come next to people and say, we can do this, we're in this together, I'm with you, we don't maybe know all the answers, but we're going to find that out together. I'd love your input. Let's slowly rebuild. I think that's definitely an approach. There are, though, I know sectors, industries and organizations who right now are going, this crisis is an amazing opportunity for us to innovate. Now, if I as a leader come in and I go, it's okay, I'm not sure, like if I do that other style in that environment, we've got a complete mismatch. Okay?
Yeah.
So for some of those organizations, you might want someone who, so this coercive leader here on the screen, you may want someone who has all of a sudden stands up with very clear vision, with an end game in mind, who says, this is an amazing opportunity for us to completely change everything. This is where we're going to head. Come on, guys, we can do this. Like, rally around. That's not a negative approach. That's actually maybe what those people need. And so I'm reminded, I tell this story all the time, but I'm reminded of the drill bit company. There was a drill bit company in America who had market share. And they were very, very successful for many, many years. And they went through a crisis and they lost market share. And there was other drill bit manufacturers who were taking over the industry. And they got to a crisis moment. And now they could have said, come on, we want to be best again. We're going to push, we're going to take back our market share. But they had the wisdom and forethought to stop and have their leadership say, what are we in the business of doing? And that drill bit company realized that the business they were in was not making drill bits. The business they were in was making holes.
Yep.
That's actually the business, was making holes. Now they diversified and became the largest distributor of lasers that cut holes in the world. Now, leadership that can risk and be courageous enough to put something down for the greater good in that moment had huge benefit. So I don't know what the group you're leading needs. For all the leaders, any leaders who are listening, what I'm saying is you are best reading your situation, your stage of group, and working out how leadership can be effective in the exact space that you are leading. And I would say if you're not good naturally at the type of leadership your group needs, get some support or ask somebody to come in and help you deliver that style. But don't just go with the one you know if it's not the right one. That would be my thought.
And sometimes that's as simple as identifying a person who's already in the team who's showing signs of being able to pull that off, and giving them the platform, letting them be the ones telling the story. Yeah, that's good.
So that's my thought. So I don't know. I brought these up because I think you could separate these situational leadership styles and say these are heroic and these are post-heroic, and then you could say these are bad, these are good. I don't think it's that simple. I think the reason there's a rise in post-heroic being important is for a long time, heroic was the only model. What I'm trying to say is as we elevate post-heroic leadership as being important, maybe we don't throw it all out. Maybe there's as with most things in life, it's probably not black or white. It's somewhere in the grey. There are elements there that are really important for us to understand. Here, I got another quote for us here. Because here, this is a definition of heroic leadership that's actually really positive, right? So the heroic leader, the charismatic, goal-scoring superstar who doesn't mind carrying the team on his back, is out. Enter the post-heroic leader, the quieter, engaging team player who brings every player into the decision-making process. In fact, today's complex business environment requires a leader who combines the best of both styles. I imagine that statement of Michael Jordan would sound ridiculous.
Yeah.
But for me, I think...
Because you pass it to me.
That's right. It's right. And so... And you had that, right? Because even in that documentary, right, the night that Michael's like sick and vomiting and can barely walk, what does he do? He scores 35 points. Yeah. Now, again, I'm not mocking that and putting that down. That's how he's wired. And you know what? Many people in the documentary also said how much he inspired them.
Yeah.
There's power in that.
Yeah.
But I think with maturity and time comes an awareness that is not, there are other elements that potentially, that you can pass the ball to Steve Kerr and he can score and you can still win. And I think that's the growth. That's the growth we see, I think, a bit in that documentary, which I think that's fascinating to watch. My last thing I just wanted to kind of throw out there, and I looked at the idea of heroic leadership in people who don't hold positional power necessarily. And I think this is worth a comment that there are people in society and that we have witnessed who all of a sudden stand out in their leadership. It's not because of their role. They're not the CEO of something or the whatever of something. But they have such a conviction that something needs to change and that something needs to happen and is right, some kind of moral, bigger purpose, that they carve out a leadership space for themselves. And it's often in a very heroic style that actually mobilizes and motivates people to start on that journey. So the quotes were things like Martin Luther King says, This is something that we need to hold on to. That civil rights is important, and I will lead, and I will have a voice, and I will be charismatic, and I will be clear about these things, and I will lead. And I think it's worth a comment about post-heroic leadership works when you're in a positional space where you're leading direct people. And I imagine, and I know the civil rights movement then needed a bunch of people to help put that vision into action, right? But there is a space often within our society where there is a need for people to break out from the pack, to be innovative, to be clear, to be charismatic, and to be bold and to articulate something that inspires other people. So I don't know what you think about that, and if I've again sprung that on you, but that was something I read today, and I was like, you know what, I think that's a powerful thought.
I think one of the and this is almost like again, it's a subtext of some of my experience. My approach has always been to be very collaborative and consultative and I think that's why the idea of post-heroic leadership calls out to me, because there's a sense where it resonates with some of the style that I've tended to bring in my leadership. And something that's really been a challenge for me is I think I've used that mode and that model as a reason or an excuse not to step out, not to be confident. There's a sense of I'm masking a lack of self-confidence or a lack of willingness to step out in faith, because I want to make sure I'm collaborating with others and things like that. Whereas I think you're right. There is a time for the prophetic. There is a time on the fast break to call out, to demand the ball, because it's time to actually sink a basket right now. And so I think for me personally, I'm reticent to be that person, but I'm also mindful that there's going to be times in my leadership journey in the different seasons that I'm a part of where that's what's required, and that's what I'm being called to operate in, and I need to be okay with that as much as I am okay with the times where I'm collaborating with a team and trying to provide a platform for them to step into as well. I agree. History shows us. I think history has idolized those leaders perhaps too much at times. But by the same token, if it's not for those times in history where someone's been willing to step in and go, "This is not okay. Here's where we need to go," then the progression of us as human beings just wouldn't have happened. So that's kind of some of my personal reflections on what you're saying.
And look, history will also tell us that heroic style of leadership can be used for good and for evil. That style of leadership stands, even though what that style of leadership represents is key, right? And so some of the greatest movements and the worst movements in our history have been around people being very vocal and heroically leading people to a certain ideology, and that's important. What it's leading, not just who is leading. I guess in that space. So, I just again, I like this is big and it's deep, and I don't think it's one or the other. That's why it's not a versus scenario. That's my takeaway from this right now. It's a you know what, I'm challenged to take on elements of this inspirational, clear, focused, leading, heroic leader at times. There's a moment where Steve Kerr needs to realize he's not on the floor just to pass the ball. There are times where Steve Kerr needs to let that thing fly and win the game. And you know what? He needs to be ready to step. It's funny, again, I didn't realize we were going to talk about this so much, but there's a moment where Michael looks at him in that last game of the season and he says, "If it comes," and Steve goes all nervously, he goes, "If the ball comes, Michael, I'll be ready. I'll be ready. I'll be ready, Michael." Like, it's hilarious, right? But it's that there's that in that moment, if the ball comes to you and your role at this moment is to shoot, you need to be ready to shoot. And it's okay. You don't need to just say, "No, I'm the passing guy." No, we need passing guys. But sometimes the passing guy needs to shoot. And sometimes the shooter needs to learn to rely on the other guy to finish things off. So anyway, that sounds like a very natural ending to our discussion somehow.
I like it.
Thanks for joining me. That was fun. We might have to do this a little more often around topics that seem to fly up. Just to finish, anyone who's listening, if you wanted to listen to more of the Flea Factory podcast is available. You can find that on fleafactory.com.au or on any of your podcasting platforms. Hopefully this will start to live stream next time we do a few on YouTube as well. And so if you want to hit like and follow on the Facebook page, but also on the YouTube, you'll get notifications when we go live in the future. I'm hoping to have a bunch of different guests and a bunch of people talk about their experience of different leadership, self-awareness, self-development, how they put their lives together, career, who knows what we'll talk about. But as they come up, we'll go live and we'll chat. And if you want to sit on the wall and have a listen, you're more than welcome. So thanks for joining me, Trav. This was fun. We'll do it again soon.
Thank you.
See you, mate.
See ya.